So, good morning to everybody. I hope that you had the opportunity to have a good rest after the intense meeting yesterday and that you are still ready and save some energy for some important topics that we still have to deal with this morning before we move to the executive session and then close the meeting. In fact, this morning we have the technology working group report or update on their conclusions on the fact-finding that they have been undertaking, as well as the update of the engagement team and group audit work before we go to the executive session. So I would now give the floor to Brian, thanking him for the work that the working group has been doing and asking him to provide us with conclusions or observations of the work, that you have been undertaking, the outreach and the fact-finding work. Brian, please.
Thanks very much, Gabriella, and good day, everyone. It's a bit premature for conclusions, I'll say. I'll also note that we, the board, currently have an exposure draft open on technology, and so this is really just an update on where we're at. Our group is going to be continuing its work this afternoon and tomorrow as well. And then I think we can start really talking about conclusions and so on. Okay, that's me. Perfect. Okay, so for today's session, I'm going to start just with a quick recap to remind everyone of the tech initiative overall and how the different pieces fit together, particularly for those members of the board who are newer. And then I'll spend the bulk of our time giving you an overview of the work that we've been doing and the preliminary themes that have arisen out of our ongoing outreach and fact-finding work, including the involvement of the tech experts group that we put together in March. I'll also brief you on the process that we've been using to deliberate on the different issues that we found and what we've heard from folks, and then give you a high-level look at some of the types of insights that we're working with and that we're continuing to analyze. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about the next steps that are planned to take us to the point of releasing our final report, which will be in September. We are not, as I said, presenting conclusions or recommendations today because the work is still ongoing, though it is nearly complete. But of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions of note that you might have on immediate reactions at this stage. Okay, so just a short recap then. So our initiative began back in 2018 with the first iteration of this working group, which was focused on understanding the impact of AI and big data on the ethical decision-making of PAs. And following the TWG's extensive outreach at that time and desk research, the phase 1 report was issued in the first quarter of 2020. And that report contains 7 categories of recommendations that are related to potential code changes. And it also provided some recommendations as to non-authoritative materials that the board might consider producing or that the board might consider advocating for the production of. Those were all based on what stakeholders were really asking for additional guidance on. And at that point, the board then struck a task force to continue the work, prioritizing the potential code implications. But that group also had a mandate to produce non-authoritative materials and to continue fact-finding of the technologies that had not yet been evaluated. That was all a bit heavy for a single team. So earlier last year, when additional staff resources became available, the board decided to bifurcate the TTF and create a parallel working group phase 2 component. The reconstituted task force, as you know, continued on with the code change work, the drafting, and obviously, as I said, we've got a live ED in the market, which you're aware of. Whereas the working group moved ahead with that non-authoritative mandate and also with the remaining fact-finding on the technologies that had not been looked at within the phase 1 work, which were AI and big data analytics. Okay, next slide. Okay, so in summary, the TWG specifically has 2 objectives within our approved terms of reference. And the first of these is developing or facilitating the development of non-authoritative content. So things like thought leadership, different articles, putting other non-authoritative materials together. These show up as the various products that have been issued over the past year and that you'll also see coming out in the coming months still. To that end, Cam has kindly included a status update and some links where relevant to those items at the end of our cover note. And you can see also kind of where things are at when we're aiming to have those put out. And then the second and frankly trickier objective is to identify and assess the potential impact of technology on the behavior of PAs and the relevance and applicability of the code, which is much the same objective as the TWG Phase 1 group had. And as you know, that group produced some code change recommendations at its conclusion, but focused on a different subset of technologies. And I think you can immediately see why that is a trickier process, not just the breadth of technology that's being considered overall, and that these technologies continue to shift along in the landscape quite rapidly, but also because of the risk that the working group's continued research and outreach might well lead our group to determine that there are further potential code changes to either extend into the areas that the task force is considering, as well as items that are beyond the task force was mandated to consider. Needless to say, we need to be very careful as to how those findings are handled, particularly where there is an open exposure draft out there. And more on that as we go through. Okay, and then just to put it all together in terms of our process, we're obviously conducting a significant amount of fact-finding outreach and desk research, and those are things at the top. Our work has also been informed by coordinating closely with the IESBA. We've got a permanent liaison member of the IESBA. We've had meetings with the panel on accountancy education, heard from a couple of days ago. More recently, we've been benefiting from the technology experts group, where, as you'll recall, we have 8 individuals from a variety of tech fields and from different jurisdictions. These are professionals who really have their finger on the pulse of technology as it's used within the accountancy profession, and have sort of the best sense anyway of not just how the tech is being used, but are considering how it's likely to be used. Nobody knows exactly how these things are going to end up playing out in the next few years or more, but at least these folks are closest to that because they're working with these technologies and doing consulting work and whatnot every day on these items. Obviously, we're very happy to have the valuable expertise to allow our own technical breadth to be expanded by that kind of deep knowledge that's readily available. Okay, and then in the cloud there on the slide, we've taken all of the information and we've used it to compile a variety of different insights, which we're then considering in the context of the code, including the tech ED wording. So we're sort of presuming that, obviously things will change once TTF gets feedback in and once the board has deliberations, the final pronouncement will be different. But at this point, we're saying if the tech ED were taken exactly as it is now, together with the extant code, that's how we're pressure testing what the insights are from different stakeholders. And then, as I mentioned, our 2 main outputs are contributions to a variety of non-authoritative resources, as well as the Phase 2 report that's going to provide insights for the board and different task forces and working groups going into the future, hopefully. Given the pervasive nature of technology, these things can touch on other groups' work as well. And then that dotted arrow on the side reflects that as we work through our assessment, where there are insights relevant to the task force's current work, we have and will continue to share those with the TTF as input for their consideration. We're really just in the midst of that at the moment. We've had a preliminary meeting with the task force last month, and we've shared some of the initial observations and thoughts from our April in-person meeting, and we'll have further discussions or communications between our 2 groups next month. So as we are wrapping up our work and reaching kind of where our team thinks we need to be. Okay, I'm going to pause here for just a moment if there are questions or things that folks want to ask about in this area before I move on to the themes.
Thank you, Brian. Any comments or questions at this stage?
We're good?
I don't think so.
All right, perfect. Okay, so the big picture themes that we've used to classify the insights that stakeholders have expressed is the next area. So as far as outreach goes, we've met with a large number of stakeholders over the past year and a bit, representing tech companies, those charged with governance, public sector, different regulators, PAIBs, including some PAIBs directly just in companies, firms, PAOs, and national standard setters. And these meetings and discussions resulted in over 75 pages of really very detailed notes and insights. We always had staff on hand for all of the meetings, and there's pretty extensive notes that were taken about different items that were raised and discussed. And what we did next was we sifted through those comments and we highlighted the ones that had particular relevance for PAs in an ethics decision-making context. And that process yielded a list of 425 items. It's a nice big spreadsheet that we then, obviously you got to manage that in some way. And so we grouped these different items into 24 categories to make them more manageable, given that obviously there's overlap between what different stakeholders said. And then we further grouped those down into 8 major themes. So I'm going to run through those themes and sub-themes next. Hard to say that 3 times. And you'll note that as I go through them, there's still some overlaps between some of these themes because they're not always clear cut, and they also overlap a little bit. You'll also note that some of the themes and messages are ones that we have heard before, but at that stage of the process, we're not looking to filter out these items from the background, because if it's meaningful to stakeholders, especially different stakeholders that we've heard from during phase 2 and from different regions, then there obviously continues to be emphasis on those matters, and it's useful for us and other stakeholders to be aware of what's really being emphasized by people at this point. So as part of our analysis step, though, which is the next step after we take all these items and we filtered them out and categorize them, then we take into account whether or not something was heard before, whether it's been discussed before, how it was addressed by the board. So let's carry on. All right, so in terms of the themes, first of these, they're not in any particular order. These are just the themes as we started working through the content. This is how they appeared. You could mix and match here as you like. Seems to be a somewhat logical flow, at least for the first couple. First one is public interest responsibility and accountability, sorry. Stakeholders frequently commented that emerging and transformational technologies are leading to both opportunities and threats for PAs. No surprise there. Many of those have ethics implications, and that also provide an impetus for the profession to take action on these different items and areas, and it is impacting the profession and the role of PAs. A broad and common view expressed was that PAs are expected to be leaders in terms of ethical decision-making in organizations, and that includes with respect to managing technology-related challenges that stem from the need for responsible development, implementation, and use of these different technologies. So we are seen as you should be the people, or we should be the people, depending on the stakeholder, that has a seat at the table and is directly involved in this decision-making from an ethical leadership perspective, given, and I think this is a testament to the board's work over decades, right? Having a strong principles-based code and a consistent one that's international. There was also an understanding that we don't bear sole responsibility, much as we heard on the tax side as well, in part because many of the decisions that are not or that are happening are not directly under the PA's control. And in those situations, there needs to be a consideration of how the PA and other professionals have a collective shared responsibility and how that can be worked out. Another public interest topic that emerged is, not surprisingly, sustainability. That seems to have come up more recently. It kind of became a hot topic in the past few months, more so than at the beginning of this project. But increasingly, stakeholders are mentioning this issue and how they're tying the connection for them is technology is really a required element within achieving sustainability. And if we also have PAs who are a key element in reporting on and being involved in sustainability processes, that these items are interrelated. And on the technology side, if you think, decarbonization, also regeneration of resources, things of that sort, it's hard to imagine humans doing that simply on their own. You're going to need some technological resources. And that makes it then even more important for PAs and others with a public interest and strategic stewardship perspective to collaborate in the different decision-making aspects. Okay, next item. So this theme just really broadly relates to the tech landscape in general. And the key points that we grouped here center on the trends, opportunities, and risks that are coming about because of the increased use of these technologies. So there's sort of follow-on effects of implementing the technology, not simply that are related issues that are related to the technology per se, but the consequences of implementing it. There's a broad consensus, kind of goes back to what I said before, that these trends impact the roles of PAs, including the profession overall, and specifically the ways in which ethics-related decisions are made. As part of these discussions, there was particular recognition for the need to have strong data governance and to enable organizations' abilities to build and maintain value. And again, PAs are seen as the kind of key to that. Given our existing competence with information management, it's kind of what we do. It's just a different type of information, different speed, different processes, and so on. Also, our competence in controls, in assurance issues. This is seen as a good fit for us to be able to move into that area and then to be thinking about what the impacts of that are on ethical decision making. Okay, so these are the first two themes. They kind of work together to set some of the broad context for some of the additional, more specific comments that flow out in the next few themes. Okay, first of these being competence. This is, I would say for sure, the most consistent message that we heard across stakeholder groups. Loud and clear expectation is PAs need to strongly build their professional competence outside of the core areas of financial reporting, tax, finance, assurance. And this came across from stakeholders in a couple of important ways. One is that PAs in general need to upskill in many different areas within technology. There seemed to be a gap here. In order for us also to get back to an earlier point, for us to earn our place at the table where decisions are being made so that we can be ethical leaders on the team, really, so that accountants will be chosen and thought of as being members that you want to have on this team, and not only when you're dealing with the financial reporting system. Obviously, there's no expectation that PAs need to become data scientists. Some of them are, good for them. Great place to be, definitely something I'd recommend to students that they get more involved in. But there is a consistent view that we need to be proficient enough to be able to ask the right questions and understand, and as needed, challenge the responses that are received. And that would be in things like in procurement processes or during the evaluation of technology or when these tech tools or systems are being implemented within our organizations. And then at the same time, there's a distinct understanding that many of the PA's core skills that are still very relevant in today and tomorrow's digital age, but they have to be applied in a different context. And so concepts like understanding processes and systems and designing and testing controls and understanding how to manage estimates are still fundamental. They just can operate differently, and not just with different tools, but there can be different processes involved entirely, and getting input from different folks. And then a bit more on the competence theme, because it was a really heavy one. Going beyond the technical skills, we've heard right from the beginning of the initiative in 2018 that our professional skills, judgment, skepticism, critical thinking, prioritization, communication, and so on are more important than ever. As the business environment becomes more dynamic and harder to predict due to the independent forces that include the rapid pace of technological change and the new types of technology that are out there, particularly intelligent and autonomous systems. Stakeholders point out that those skills are the ones that really distinguish us from intelligent machines, which is the direction that we're headed, even if we're not there yet in most instances. But those are what are going to continue to play a key role more and more as we work increasingly closely with machines at this point. And then finally, in this theme, there's also a common observation that do care. That aspect of the fundamental principle is also engaged, particularly as a result of automation bias risk, internal and external cybersecurity threats, and the additional work that's required when we're trying to manage uncertainty brought about by complex circumstances. So again, obviously, we're hearing things that we have heard in the past, or dealing with mis and disinformation. But again, there's a common understanding of the practical limitations of what PAs can take responsibility for, recognizing that many PAs are intimidated by the emerging technology environment and are overwhelmed by the pace of change given the realities of time and other resource constraints. Okay, so moving on, the next theme relates to objectivity. And the sub-themes are ones that, again, have been consistent since the beginning of the initiative. Stakeholders are increasingly concerned about bias in systems as more intelligent and autonomous systems come online and are being integrated with other technologies, which is something we've heard more frequently lately, such as with blockchain, IoT to gain even more data, and also cloud computing, multi-jurisdictional data storage, things like that. Or where these systems are interconnected with one another, that can then cause cascading effects where it's harder to identify the threats and the issues that can arise because you have one autonomous system feeding into another autonomous intelligent system. And then, once you're here you're already in trouble with one layer. Now you're 2 layers back and you're trading information back and forth and so on. So it really creates exponential issues that make things more challenging to understand and to ferret out where issues are. Similarly, discussions over the over-reliance on technology came up as well, noting that as humans, we need to be able to rely on technology, harness its power, but we do need to do that prudently and not rely on technology that we haven't assured to be reliable. I use that word carefully. There's 2 different meanings of that, and we did hear both. Or that we just haven't been able to assess because of a lack of transparency or explainability. And on that need for explainability, most stakeholders that are raising that issue agree that it's principally significant with systems that incorporate machine learning. We're seeing more expectations and even regulatory requirements now to assess the accuracy and the fitness for purpose of systems before using them, especially where there are concerns around equality and fairness issues, notably in Europe. But systems incorporating machine learning aren't generally able to maintain a level of explainability, so there are real challenges in being able to get the benefits of those tools, of which there really are many, but still mitigating the potential for harm and unintended consequences, most of which are ethical, but these things can also lead to legal consequences, as we have seen within the market. All right. Okay, next theme is around transparency. This is related to expectations for PAs to be transparent in terms of the information that they provide, the services that they offer, with respect to newer forms of technology being developed, implemented, and used. There's a recognition of the inherent level of uncertainty and the lack of understanding around some of these technologies, not just by PAs. It's important for PAs to be, this was a stakeholder broad view, was we need to be sufficiently familiar with systems that are recommended by PAs or that are deployed by PAs. And then we need to be straightforward about the limitations of the technology, the uncertainties that can be expected, and the risk of unintended consequences, as well as the broader potential for other ethics-related risks. But although there's a specific call for greater transparency, as we saw in the tax presentation as well, There's an appreciation of the limits of confidentiality, so understanding the tension between confidentiality and transparency was also something that that came up with folks. Okay, next theme relates to independence matters. So here we just really grouped the issues related to independence into this category. They can be categorized in three ways. The first relates to the risk of auditors moving into a management responsibility in situations where the firm uses advanced technology to provide assurance or where the client is especially dependent on technology. The concerns here often recognize that the firm has particular expertise that the client can benefit from, and the client might want to rely more on the auditor than is appropriate, or they might use some of the outputs from the auditor in ways that would compromise independence. It's similar to the observation that was made in the COVID-related guidance, where that group within the papers found a challenge that was expected to also worsen as the pandemic wanes. So increased reliance on the auditor and some of the outputs of the audit. Second sub-theme here concerns the potential that new emerging non-assurance services might create self-review or other threats. Obviously, these are offside, but that these threats might be difficult to identify given some of the other challenges that were noted, such as the lack of explainability of systems, the interdependence between systems and not being able to immediately see that it's creating this self-review threat or even that it might, the reliance on system outputs by unanticipated parties or in unanticipated ways, things of that sort. So there's just a general thought that there's challenges in this area and we need to be careful. Finally, also that some of the opportunities that are being created by disruptive technology can result in business relationships, another theme that we'd heard before, that wouldn't have been possible in the past. So not only is it something where these technologies are allowing business models to flourish, but there's actually new business relationships that can come up because of items that the firm simply could not undertake in the past. And again, the need to carefully evaluate these. Okay, theme 7. This one includes the various insights around multidisciplinary teams, and it starts with general observations around the increasing importance of such teams as PAs need to work more closely with technologists, with engineers, with other professionals to ensure the appropriate development, use, and application of different technologies. Also, as we are looking at the governance and the internal controls over such systems. And this ties back to the theme of that shared responsibility that was mentioned earlier. It's becoming more important to recognize that many technologies have become so advanced that we really have to work together and pool our competence to be able to use these tools to their greatest advantage while doing so safely in terms of ethical outcomes. Discussions around the increased prevalence and importance of multidisciplinary teams often turn to the role of the PAs on those teams as well. And there's a general belief that the role needs to broaden to allow involvement in a greater range of issues, particularly around the perspectives for ethical decision-making. And then lastly, here we had conversations with stakeholders about the fact that PAs are required to comply with ethics standards, of course, but that these can be strained on teams where there are other professionals and non-professionals. And the thought that when we're relying on other experts and their perspectives as part of these teams, there were open questions about how ethics of other team members are considered. And there were a number of different comments around that as well. All right, last key theme is one that's a bit of a potpourri as well, standards and guidance. This one encompasses ideas that relate either specifically to IESBA's standard setting role or that more closely relate to the role of other standard setters that IESBA in most cases collaborates with. On the IESBA related side, stakeholders recognize the importance of developing clear, consistent standards for all PAs, which is great. And some have made suggestions around increasing awareness raising, education, and guidance, particularly about our code, the strength of our code, and how the code connects to existing issues. And then with respect to comments for other standard setters, some provided comments and feedback on developing consistent and clear standards that fall outside of our remit, but we heard them and accepted those comments nonetheless because they're there. These are ideas that our board could either choose to support and advocate for, or simply pass on to those other relevant bodies for their consideration. Okay. I'll stop in a second to take questions, but let me tell you just a little bit more about the tech experts group and their involvement with providing input, because their input was on the previous group, not of slides, but of all of the content before. So those 425 plus different issues that were noted, and then how we categorize them into the themes and sub-themes. So they provided information about that. All right. So a few different ways. We asked them to review the high-level themes and sub-themes in the context of having the big spreadsheet with all of the different line items. They concurred with the themes that we had drawn out of that multitude of comments and observations. Interestingly, something that they noted was that the comments that we've been receiving from most stakeholders tend to be observations that are grounded in the here and now rather than being futuristic. We were cautioned that the IESBA should be mindful of the need to try and be as forward-looking as possible to stay on top of the needs for ethical decision-making. Not that we, to date, have received those future things from the TEG either. We'd love to have a crystal ball. If someone has access to one, that'd be great. No pressure. And they also specifically noted the need for the profession to be practical in terms of the expectations that are placed on PAs, again, noting that not all PAs can be expected to achieve a high level of competence in these technologies specifically, but rather the expectation should be clear for PAs to have sufficient competence to, and again, they concurred strongly with, ask the right questions and safeguard against poor ethical decisions, to appropriately evaluate responses, and then to be at the table for important tech-related decisions that they noted at this time they don't believe that PAs largely are. This still requires some significant upskilling from where the average PA appears to be at today, according to members of the TEG, and that absolutely fits with what we heard primarily from PAO reps as well. All right. Okay, so I mentioned 3 ways that we engaged the TEG. The other 2 gave us their general observations of the ethics threats related to transformational technology. And then finally, we asked them to provide us with some specific real use cases of how transformational technologies are being used in ways that lead to potential ethics questions or concerns. These use cases, particularly, I would say, help us to understand how the different technologies are being implemented or how they're being considered for implementation by organizations, so that we can assess the potential ethics implications, what we call pressure testing the code. So in terms of their insights, some of the thoughts are on the screen for you here. We noted consistency with respect to the earlier themes. So for example, the emphasis on PAs being able to ask the right questions, regardless of the specifics of the technology that's being used. They did note, though, that as important as this is, the typical PA is not that likely at this point to adequately question system outputs, and again, that they see automation bias as being a real concern. Expanding on the comments around being realistic about the level of technology competence that can be expected of PAs, the TEG emphasized that the expectation should be for PAs to know enough about how a system or tool works to be able to determine whether it's justifiable to use it or to rely on its results, similar to the way that we're expected to be able to assess whether a human expert can be relied upon or not. It was also noted that most PAs don't automate their own work, but that rather that it's far more typical for the automation processes to be done by technologists or others on the IT team, or through the use of third-party tools that are then implemented within an organization and sort of imposed into departments. This was seen as a key area for where more PA involvement would be directly beneficial in order to ensure that appropriate outcomes are achieved and that PAs maintain control over and also accountability for the information that's produced or the decisions that are being made. On the independent side, the TEG echoed the concerns about determining at what point providing an audit client with business insights on data that was analyzed during the audit crosses into the realm of management responsibility, while also noting the benefits of the client having access to these insights in order to aid in their reporting and their decision making. We had an interesting discussion around the responsibilities of PAs in situations where technology might be used by organizations for ethically questionable purposes. And interestingly, TEG members made a clear distinction between the professional ethics obligations of a PA versus the broader questions of morality, recognizing that there's a lot of gray area in between those two. And then with respect to the code, the TEG also noticed the need for continued focus on principles, broad language within standard setting to help future-proof the requirements and the application material, given the continually shifting landscape. All right, so at that point, I will now stop. And if there's questions, comments, thoughts, reactions on the themes and sub-themes, and particularly on the process that we're following, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much, David, for this comprehensive presentation on the observations coming from the fact-finding exercise and the outreach activity. We already have some people around the table. Laurie, please.
Yes, thank you, Brian. That actually was helpful to bring us back to where all this is. And I know the TEG is still in relatively early days in terms of coming together as a group. But you actually touched on the point that I raised yesterday, which is the futuristic kind of what next, what's around the corner. And I think that's what causes me a level of anxiety. Not that the current as is stuff doesn't either, because I agree with the comment that there's a lot of justifiability concern in terms of people just, okay, I have this tool, so I use it. I don't necessarily know how it works, et cetera. But the future stuff and the ethical implications, I don't have my head around. So I'm just personally very interested in that. But I think as a group, we need to be as well, because when this area moves, it tends to move very quickly, and then we get behind it. The second thing is I noticed that the TEG members provided realistic use cases. Personally, I'd be interested in seeing those, because I think that's part of educating us in terms of what are those realistic use cases, because I think in the particular area you're working in, for us to connect it to the ethical side of the code is a learning curve. So I would just say that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Mark.
Thank you. Really interesting, Brian. So an enormous amount of food for thought there. Two things that sort of come to mind. One, I was really struck by one of your earlier comments about the importance of sort of digital and data governance. And I think, you know, that is almost a sort of fundamental building block for us to get our arms round and understand, because without that being properly taken account of, then it almost sort of doesn't matter where you go with technology, because it's not properly underpinned by a thorough consideration of what the ethical issues arising out of that are. So I was really pleased to see that in. I suppose sort of two questions really is that one is the working group has been, you know, hugely industrious in giving us all of this insight. And at some point, I suppose we get to a question of, well, you can't boil the ocean. You've got to find out, you know, what are your top three and where are we going? And it'd be really interesting to sort of understand how your sort of next steps go. And then the other thing is we had sort of our sort of new members had their sort of introduction session, second introduction session into IESBA yesterday, and we had a sort of bit of a discussion on NOCLAR that Jeff and Deanne sort of took us through. And one of the things that comes out very strongly in the NOCLAR piece is that your response can depend on the situation in your jurisdiction. So you can have a proper framework, you can have a proper reporting obligation, you can have safety and security in carrying out and discharging those responsibilities. And of course, in technology, there are going to be huge variances between different jurisdictions. And how do we land something that meets the needs of a global code, but at the same time doesn't get seen to be a sort of safe option and not reflect, as Laurie said, the speed with which developments are moving? But enormously encouraging to see the amount of stuff that is going on, and really good to see that you're getting some great input from the TEG that you set up. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Andy.
Thank you. Terrific presentation, Brian. It's we're getting quite a resource of all of these issues that are going to be very useful. And so, forgive me if I probably mentioned this in the past, and I'll probably forget that I'm mentioning it now, and I'll mention it in the future. But I imagine your working group is aware that in 2024, the American CPA license model is going to go from a core to a core plus discipline to get the licensure, and one of those disciplines is information systems and technology. So to move to the space of folks who are in the information systems place, if they can demonstrate cores in accounting, can become a licensed CPA. And so along those lines, the NASBA has published its curriculum guide, which includes a lot of information about data ethics and advanced data ethics and other information systems. It's just a possible another resource for the working group to consider for topics that I'm skeptical that there'll be topics there that your working group hasn't already considered, but perhaps it's just another validation, another source of topics. Just wanted to refer you to the NASBA curriculum, which I believe is a public document. Yep.
Thank you, Andy. Luigi.
Yeah, and thank you for this very comprehensive analysis and summary. One of the things that may be useful for me, for us, in order to try to appreciate the impact of this outcome are probably the details of this observation. Because if I take one, for example, the point number 5, the fact that an auditor is providing insight on the basis of its work can range from nothing to an ask to something different, depending on different factors, circumstances, situations, and so on and so forth. So it would be really useful to understand the background of the top 3, as Mark said, issues that you believe should be considered in order to really understand the use cases, to understand what is behind these comments. Because elsewhere, I think would be really difficult to take actions just on the basis of this very short summary.
Thank you, Luigi. Junpei.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And Brian, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I think that technology experts group is not necessarily composed of geographically diverse people, which is shown in last meeting material. I think the progress of technology is different in jurisdictions, and that should be covered. So I would appreciate if you explain how to deal with this diversity thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Junpei. Caroline?
Thanks, Chair. Brian, thanks for the presentation, and I really do appreciate you and the working group synthesizing and condensing all the work that has been done and all the information gathered into this presentation on the fact finding. One thing that struck me is an opportunity here for us to to collaborate and coordinate with the IPAE and focus on education, because quite a number of the findings that came out were really about how we educate the future generation of professional accountants so that they will have the right skills and essentially the right ethical values and standards as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Galen?
Yeah, just following up on what Andy was talking about, he's absolutely correct. And that document is public. I think since we're meeting in the NASPA offices in September, it might be an opportunity, Brian, to get your committee together with some of those folks. I don't know if that can be arranged or not, but one of the reasons for the update that Andy was referring to is to give people a career path within the profession. Prior to this, an individual with all sorts of technology background without a CPA license would be prohibited in most cases becoming a partner in a, well, they could become a partner in a firm, but they couldn't necessarily sign an audit report on some of these information technology examinations that are being done. And so I think it's probably a very legitimate effort to meld the profession with technology as it evolves.
Thank you, Galen. Felicia?
Thank you, Chair. And it was a good presentation overall. The theme that caught my eye most is the one of competence, like my colleagues have just mentioned. Technologies have evolved and there are many. If you look at blockchain technologies, IoT, big data, how do you expect a professional accountant to grasp all these things and possibly be judged as competent enough to be able to carry out his job in terms of either opinions that are being signed or even professional accountants in business? I find it very challenging it's good, of course, technology to be driving business across the board. But in terms of competence, I wonder how a professional accountant is going to be able to juggle all these technologies and be able to be judged as competent. So I don't know, maybe more food for thought. And I would like to hear more from the working group. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia. I think that there are no, sorry. Laurie? Sorry.
Sorry, just briefly, I wanted to build on something that Mark said that I meant to mention as well. I think the data governance point is one that is particularly useful for us. And when I think about it in two buckets. One is the use of the data beyond what it was originally intended for, because it's a real risk, I think, when people have data in their hands and tools that can move that data around and slice it and dice it in different ways. And there are ethical issues around that go beyond consent as well, because sometimes that data includes personal data. And then there's the cross-border element for any firms that are working cross-border, and the ability for that data to move very quickly and easily into regimes that have different data protections. So there's obviously a lot around that. But I also think there's an interesting perspective of sometimes regulators around that data. Yes, we have data privacy rules, but hey, you have that data in your possession. You should be able to be using that in your decision making, which isn't necessarily true, is it? Because it may exist and be hived off in certain countries or certain legal entity units. So I think that's an area to explore, because I think there is an expectation gap. I'm working on a very large project right now in the AML and KYC space, and this is an area where you get consent to get data from clients to accept them. And we've run into that very quickly, that people are like, oh, you can just move that data all over the world. And there is some regulatory expectations that you use something that you know in Africa to make a decision in the UK. And that's a challenging thing you have to think about, because it's not always possible to do. But on the other hand, there's some good things around that if you can manage it. So I'll leave it at that. But I think that Mark's data governance point was important. And then lastly, on the makeup of the TEG, and I'm sorry, I don't have the list in front of me. Do we have external kind of the futuristic type people on there? Because I that's a hard topic to get at for me. So you can answer that. I wouldn't even know how to touch that one.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.
Ken.
Thank you very much, Chair Diaz. I just, Brian, I'm just looking at the slide that's in front of us, and there are a number of useful sort of points of feedback from the TEG into your working group, and in fact, as you were going through your own presentation, speaking about the various themes and so forth, and the involvement of PAs and the potential risks or threats from their vantage points. I'm just wondering whether there is an opportunity for your group, or even a need, as you further analyze the various points of input, to think about the distinction between the different levels of seniority amongst PAs, because some of these observations cast a very wide net, or have a very broad sort of reach. For example, I'm looking at the second one. The average PA has automation bias and doesn't question system outputs. And if I were to kind of take this down one level to say, look, I mean, if I'm the average PA and I'm using one piece of software within the Microsoft suite of office productivity tools, if I'm thinking from that PA's perspective, would I have automation bias, given that that sort of set of tools is widely used and accepted, and is basically very essential and has been well established, etc. So does automation bias come into play in that context, as opposed to a situation where I'm a PA in a let's say in a security company that is responsible for using or utilizing a technology tool to perform some sort of analysis on customer data in order to identify whatever trend or whatever risks the company might be intending to identify, and that it is a tool that is very custom designed. It has a very specific purpose, certainly not used on a worldwide basis. It is very bespoke. And in that context, it is a very different context. It is a very different context. But importantly, I would also think about my role within the organization. And my organization might have a number of PAs from the junior level to the most senior levels. You might well have a PA who is responsible for making the decision, for making the call as to which system to use and how to deploy that system, etc. And is there a need to speak more about the expectations there? First of all, from the contextual perspective, and also from the perspective of this sort of level of seniority and the expectations for responsibility and accountability. So just some food for thought as you go forward.
Thank you very much, Ken. Galen, Jumpai, do you want to come in again, or? Okay, thank you very much. If I may add one question on my side, very simple one, but it's more curiosity than other thing. In your analysis, observation, etc., of all these technological impacts on the accountancy profession, do you take on board, or do you separate, or any? I mean, there are two. As I see it, the technology has two kinds of impacts in the accountancy profession. One, which is direct, so to speak, because they are using different tools, different technological tools to make their work, automation, etc. But it also impacts the business and the governance and the models, etc. of the companies or the clients they are to whom they are providing services. Do you take both into consideration, or do you separate them, or is there any difference between the way you look at the impacts directly in the accountancy business profession performance and in the client's activity? Maybe I wasn't clear.
Can you rephrase what?
Yes.
Sorry.
The technology impacts in the way the accountants perform their activity, because they use tools which are different from the past, automation and artificial intelligence, etc. But the same happens with the companies, the clients, whatever, the businesses to whom they provide services. This impacts from the perspective of the impacts that they produce in the accountancy profession and work. Do you take them both together without any distinction? Do you make any distinction? Do you think that there is grounds for distinguishing them?
Got it. Thanks. Yeah, there's maybe we'll try to limit the. I'll try to.
Sorry, David. I think
Okay.
James wants to.
Sorry, if I can add, and I know we're moving forward. It's just an observation right from the beginning, which is forward-looking. And I guess as I listen, it's excellent presentation, and it's walked through so many features very logically and with methodology. I guess looking forward, and maybe and this is a personal observation, a lot that we're doing around today's is a little bit defensive in terms of helping address and counteract, etc., and being subject to the technology environment. And the point was looking forward. I suppose there's two questions in my mind, and no answer today, I think. But at what point do we transform our relatively, if you think about justifiability, that's a little bit defensive, asking the right questions. At some point, our competency framework has to turn positive. We have to be able to provide a competent level of familiarity, et cetera, with technology. And I know it's the education regime, but at some point we will have to find, I think, whether it's an expert level of knowledge, a proficient level of knowledge, or a basic level of knowledge. And I think that's a positive statement, setting up the expectations of competency. And I think some of our items here are a little bit defensive. But what I see happening as we think about ethics, and there is the reality of ethical blindness that happens in fraud and complex environments. But as we move forward, there may be a positive way to express the expectations of professional accountants to make use of technology in aiding their ethical or service performance. And I know we're making steps there, but future-proofing the code, I think, is looking towards what our expectations are around that, a level of competency and inherent requirement to make use of technology in their decision-making process. So maybe from defensive to offensive. Again, no answers, but as we journey, it may be something we think about as technology settles down. Okay, technology won't settle down, but no. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Brian, please.
Thanks. Maybe on the next time I pause, we can take fewer questions. I think then I can address them more easily. But I'm happy if my TWG colleagues want to weigh in on items that I have not weighed in on. James, just to hit your point first, which is an interesting one, and I agree. If we're going to be an effective profession, we will need to turn that and become positive. But I think it probably is just more in the nature that within ethics standard setting, we don't so much set standards that are positive. We tend to look at what the guardrails need to be in place, right? So I think it probably is more the remit of other groups like the education group, who are, as you're obviously well aware, working very strongly toward pushing that. I think we can look at guidance in that area, and I think some of the guidance that our group and other groups is putting out or are putting out do try to hit some of the encouraging the right behavior, thinking about how technology can assist in ethical decision making, doing the right thing, and so on, and not just saying thou shalt not do such and such, right? But it's a good point, and it's something that the profession needs to keep in mind. If we don't turn the corner, we won't be relevant at some point anymore. So we have to get there. And Gabriella, just on your point in terms of the distinction, it's yes and no. It's a legal answer, depends. The yes, there's a distinction when we think about issues like how firms are using the technology and what the impacts might be on independence. That really we're looking at from a firm perspective. But we look at these things quite consistently when you think of the firm as just any other business and they're employing and deploying some of these different technologies within their own or for their own purposes, right? And to make their own processes more efficient, then really you're just thinking about it as a group of PAIBs who are implementing the technology. What are the different issues that they need to think about ethics-wise as they implement those technologies or develop them? But there are client-specific things, so it's a bit of both. So Lori, agreed. Technology tends, especially disruptive technologies, tends to move in a bit of fits and starts, right? So we do have to watch that, and that is some of the issue also around this forward-looking component. You can kind of only look forward to the next phase, and then there's kind of dark periods where AI, for instance, right, the development of it kind of stagnates for a while, and then some brilliant folks come up with a way of mitigating the issue, and then progress suddenly happens, and it can be quite quick. We've seen a huge amount of development lately in natural language processing, things like that with GPT-3. So there's examples of where you just see these massive improvements in things that are happening, and it's a bit hard to predict those. To the point of, do we have the right people on the TEG? I mean, we think so. These are people that are intimately involved with these different technologies. They are staying up to date on this content day in and day out. So if not them, really not sure who. You could look at taking just someone who says they are purely a futurist. I think we've all probably listened to different speakers who are futurists, and they're very general and broad about some of the things that they see. You can probably just watch sci-fi movies, because eventually those things always seem to play out at some point in the future. So maybe we should take guidance there. I don't know. They're entertaining anyway. You had mentioned also about the use of the or the sharing of the use cases. Yes, that is the group's intent, is to share the analysis of some of those. Really, a good place for that is going to be through some of the non-authoritative materials that those will happen. That's how we've already been sharing some of the use cases, not from TEG because those are more recent, but use cases that we received from some of the other stakeholder participants and other folks that gave us some ideas. You also raised a point around the use of client data, which I think is a super relevant one. Stay tuned. In fact, so relevant that there's a slide coming up later exactly on that point. It does raise issues about the use of client data for your own systems and how you handle that. And it's something we're thinking about and that probably the board ought to think about. Mark, on the importance of data governance, couldn't agree more with that. That's something that we heard from other stakeholders. It's definitely something that our group has talked about and supports, agrees with completely. In terms of scoping the issues, absolutely, that's important. We have heard so many different things that narrowing this down has been the difficult part, because we were tasked at the beginning with boiling the ocean in 2018, and the first group did part of that as much as they could, and the second group, kind of continued on from there. But at some point, you do have to say, where are we at? I'll make a general comment to the board, and that's, I think, and my team can correct me if they think otherwise, but I think the way our discussions have gone, we're feeling like the outreach that we're doing now is leading to almost all comments being things that we've heard before or variations of issues that we've heard before, which is making us feel pretty comfortable that we're in a good place at this point. It's not that every single outreach at this point we're saying, wow, here's another basket of trouble that we need to deal with. How do we handle this? It's things where we're going, okay, yeah, that's a variation of the same thing. And I think that you'll have seen that already in the themes that we've come up with. There are a variety of these things that came up during phase one. I mean, that's just the reality is, and I don't think we need to hide that. The fact is, that's what stakeholders are telling us. And if they are, that should give us more comfort over the issues that were addressed in phase one through the tech task force, that those are really largely in line with what we're still hearing. That's a good place to be. Kind of makes me feel like we've caught up a bit to technology. Yes, we might not be super future looking at this point, but it's really hard to do that. But for a standard setting body to feel like it's pretty caught up on a topic, especially like technology, I think that's pretty good. We aren't hearing from stakeholders, you guys are really missing X. Like, why have you not done such and such? Maybe that'll come after the report comes out and we say that, we're changing our focus or what have you. But at this point, we've talked to a lot of stakeholders. That is not the messaging that we're receiving. And I take some comfort in that. The issue of the global applicability of the code, I mean, that's always a risk, an issue that I guess IESBA has to deal with. Principles-based, broad language, right? Trying to incorporate what we're really hearing. I will note, though, that we have not heard huge variances, actually really material variances between jurisdictions. And Junpei, this goes to your point as well. We've spoken with stakeholders around the world. We've not heard huge differences in terms of what they see as the ethical challenges addressed or needing to be dealt with by these technologies that are coming in. Still a good point. We still you have to check that, right? You have to verify those thoughts and what people are saying. But that's kind of our position at this stage. Andy, yeah, thanks around the IESBA model. It is something you mentioned, but I think it's always worth to underlining because it's important. It's something also that we did hear from other PAOs and from different national standard setters just around what's happening in their jurisdictions. It's an important area. I would say, and this actually gets Caroline to your point, also Felician's point, and somewhat to what James was saying as well. And that's, yes, the certification model and the competency frameworks for certification are important, and they really are changing already. I don't know that we certainly as a body don't really need to be pushing for change in that area. That's the remit of the education panel, but PAOs and NSSs know that these things have to change. They've been working on that for years already. So that's okay. The issue is not so much around newly certified members of the profession, but it's what do you do with the 3+ million members of the profession already and upskilling them? So it's that's more what we're hearing from stakeholders, that it wasn't such a big deal from stakeholders to say, hey, you need to change the curriculum and these components need to be added. That was almost it's a given. It's like, of course we have to do that. And it's already happening, but it's the rest of the folks. And it is increasingly difficult to be considered competent. That I think that's true in every profession. That's not just accountancy, but the breadth and the expectations that the public have of professionals is increasing. And that is a result of technology, because as a consumer, as an end user, I can go online and I can do all kinds of research. I'm sure everybody that has some ailment will go on to whatever your favorite medical site is and look at the symptoms and say, what do I think I have? And you come in a little bit more prepared when you talk to the doctor. Doctors are aware of that, right? And so you think you've got the answer. Maybe not all of us do that, but definitely that's a public issue where people come in and they have predetermined what they think the answer is. And so there is a higher expectation on professionals, and that's going to be a challenge. Luigi, in terms of the issues you were referring to, that point number 5 there, agreed. This is a summary, and so the details aren't all in here. So I just ask you to wait for both the discussion as part of the TWG and TTF collaboration that's coming up, and then also obviously in the detailed report is where the disposition of these different comments and the final recommendations will come out. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Galen. Also great comments around the competence issue, and Felician covered that. And lastly, I think, Ken, just in your point in terms of scalability, yes, that's something that should be considered in terms of what the responsibility is, particularly as you think about those accountability questions and what PAs should be responsible for given their level. Like, how much do you expect a PA to understand, to ask questions before using the tools and the systems that they're involved with? I'll say, and I think you brought up Excel as an example, and there, the way that I would look at it is it's not so much questioning the coding underlying Excel, but there it's, and I think this has probably happened to everyone, all of us who use Excel, which is most people in the room. How many times have you picked up a spreadsheet and dropped numbers in there, and it's a big, complicated spreadsheet? Like, do you go back and look at how all of those different, which function is being used here and which cells are connected, and when you have done that, because you've looked at the output and thought something doesn't feel right, or this just looks unusual or whatever, you've found an error within that tool, rather than just simply saying, look, the previous 4 years, and I mean, I'll pick a real example from my past where it's, you're given a working paper that is in the form of an Excel spreadsheet, and this paper has been used for 4 years in the past, and it's just you're told just plug the numbers in there and it'll produce the and then if it's in this range, do X. If it's not, then do Y. And you're looking at that and you think, okay, that's odd. You go back and you realize actually this hasn't been programmed right, and not by Microsoft, but rather by colleagues who have made adjustments and customized this particular, pretty simple, but still technology tool. So it's just, what is it that you should question? And that I think speaks in particular to your point, is what aspects do we want people to question? If this is a really well-heeled tool, do I need to be thinking about the coding within that? Well, probably not, but I should certainly always be thinking about the reasonableness of the outputs. And if there is an issue, well, maybe there is a problem with the coding, right? Or maybe it's something in my methodology, which with Excel is probably more likely the case. But okay. And I think Vanya wanted to follow up on something early on.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Very good presentation. And I'd just like to comment on both Gabriella's and James' point about we tend to look at technology in a defensive way, not in a positive way. Because for our generation, it is a kind of disruptor. It's different from what we are used to do. And to learn something new is always much more difficult than to do the old way, what we already do. But if you are to look at what we are able to do now in our profession as compared to what we were able to do some decades ago, we will see that we have much more to benefit from technology than to fear about that. And this defensive way that we have to discuss technology is not the way that the young generations do. And so if you want to attract youngers to our profession, we must discuss technology in the same way that they do, looking at the positives, looking at the facilities, looking at the development that it can bring. And so I think that we should cross this line and be less defensive and more open to the benefits of technology in order to change this reality of being so defensive, so scaring. When we discuss technology in this board, we are scared of the trouble of the change that we should provide in the regulations and the standards. And we do not look that on the other way, it can help us to make our profession safer.
Thank you, Vanya. And thank you, Brian, for, I think that you have addressed all the questions, which is impressive after the amount of questions that you had to take at the same time. And sorry, maybe I should have stopped somewhere, but I think that you addressed them all. I don't think that you have any other comments here around the table. So first, do you want to? Sorry.
I'm going to continue. Sorry.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. And thanks. And if I did not answer your question explicitly, please just come and talk to me or one of our fantastic team members here who will be able to do so. Okay, so for the final kind of major part of the presentation, the big activity of the TWG, other than eventually pulling all of this into a comprehensive, cohesive, understandable report where Cam has a lot of work and a huge role to play. The TWG's major activity involves then evaluating all of those different insights and the use cases that we received in the context of the code, and then seeing what the potential implications are. In terms of our deliberations, we took all of the highlighted insights from stakeholders. That was those 425 plus items from the 75 pages of detailed notes that I talked about earlier. And we extracted those that appear to have at least the potential of impacting the code or the board's work more broadly. And so we filtered out, for example, comments that, while they were still important comments from stakeholders, they were reflective of background or contextual information that would be either useful for our report, just kind of in the background section or as context, or for possible use in future authoritative resources. So again, in kind of putting them alongside some of the use cases that we saw, because people said, here's kind of how technology is working. This is sort of where we see the technology being implemented or being used. And then we've got those use cases as specific examples of how that's being done without obviously naming any company names. Okay. And then next, the remaining items there. So those are the ones that have potential code impact or for the board's broader consideration. Those are the ones that were and are later today and this afternoon and tomorrow being systematically run through the decision tree that's on this slide. And so we decide first whether an issue or suggestion rises to the level of even being in the code. So is this an item that's code worthy? And if the answer is no, so just walking down the right side there, we then ask whether it would be valuable to develop or recommend potential non-authoritative materials or resources in this area. And we also think about whether those already exist, or whether it seems likely what is out there is insufficient or the context is different or something like that. And if the answer is no, more NAM really isn't necessary either, then it ends up in the bottom right corner with the no further work considered necessary. Old audit term, old habits die hard. And alternatively, down the other branch, it could be a yes, where we then say, yeah, actually, you know what, it looks like more non-authoritative guidance or material probably is necessary here. People aren't getting it from our understanding of what stakeholders are telling us. And so we'd include it in our list of potential non-authoritative topics that either the board could consider or obviously, because it's a public report, that other stakeholders might consider producing content about. So we're just sharing broadly, this is what stakeholders are saying is important, and we don't think that perhaps there is enough guidance in this area, or it's something to consider. On the other side, if it is a code-worthy item, again, that's our group's decision, right? We then ask ourselves whether it's already sufficiently covered in the code, including the ED text as if it were implemented as exposed. And if the answer is yes, it is sufficiently addressed, as we have found in many of the cases that we've looked at, then we move across and again ask about the need for non-authoritative resources or guidance, because if it's something that keeps coming up, but we've had it in the code for a number of years, then you might say, it seems that people don't understand the connection of perhaps how this issue that's arising in the context of technology is really already addressed in the code, and maybe we need to connect the dots a little bit more closely, or someone has to do that. If the answer is no, we think that it's not sufficiently been addressed in the code, then it would become a recommendation for the board to consider. Those are things that will come out in the September report. The board might consider those, for instance, through the next strategic work plan and looking at the different projects that that will be on the plan or on the books for the next 4 years. Of course, the board at that time might also decide not to action our recommendation at all based on further deliberation, and that's fine. That's really a board call. Our job is to filter through the information that we receive, do this analysis, and then say, based on what TWG members think, this is kind of how we think it could be actioned by a particular group. Importantly too, and this goes back a few slides, if we're talking about items that fall within the TTF's current remit, these are particularly brought to the attention directly to the TTF to assess and dispose of, because obviously that's precisely within their purview and not ours. And these also really can't wait until the final report is issued, given that there's an ED and people are responding to that ED now. So we are sharing that information over, and then it's up to the TTF to make determinations around what to do with that feedback and the insights that have been received and then evaluated by our group. Okay, and then I just want to give you a really quick example to illustrate the decision tree. Something that we heard, like an actual one of the 425 items was, and this was within one of the themes, so we heard this a couple of times, was having the moral courage to speak up even when there's pressure to breach or bend elements in the code. So that statement goes into the top of the diagram, like all the other items. And then you can imagine this one's pretty quick to process, which is why I chose it as an example. And we would say, yes, that the item of having courage to speak up around issues like that, even when there's pressure, we'd say, yeah, that's a code-worthy point or concept. Then we'd follow that yes down to the left there. And we'd say, so is this something that's been sufficiently addressed by the code, including the ED components? And we would say pretty quickly, yes, that's already been fully addressed by the role and mindset project. So we have that in the code. And then it would just be a matter of assessing whether or not we think that more non-authoritative resources could be developed in that area to really promote that concept. That's kind of how our process works. And again, that's what we're working on, what we did work on in the April in-person meeting, and that we're doing this afternoon and tomorrow as we wrap up the remaining items within our review work and so on. So I'm going to pause really quick here for questions, just in terms of the process, so you understand the process, and then I'll get into the output component.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions about the process or any others? Luigi, please.
Brian, I'm wondering whether in this process you also exercise some sort of, I suppose so, but let's say some sort of professional judgment, or let's say you do any sort of impact analysis. Let me make an example. One of the comments is that average BA does not go through AV automation in performing his work. And the point is this a sense, a feeling? Is this something that you experienced many times in your outreach activities? Because if this is a frequent outcomes, probably it is, I would not say more important, but at least it is a higher priority. If it is just heard once, probably it is still important, but with a low priority. I don't know whether you had factored into this model something like that in order to stay aligned with the reality and what's happened really on the technology world in terms of professional accountant.
Yeah, so it's definitely a really good question, because I think that gets to exactly the devil in all of this is trying to figure out what do we do with this information. It's a huge amount of professional judgment comes into this, as you can imagine. I mean, even right from the beginning, is this something that's code worthy or not, right? Or do we think it's sufficiently covered, right? It's an opinion process, which requires our group to think about issues, think about it in the context of what outreach we've received, the desk research that we've had, right? Discussions with the TEG, things of that sort. So all of that kind of plays in, and our own experiences in working in this area to look at the answers to that, right? And to try to come up with what we think is the best answer, given the information that we have. In terms of the quantum of hearing an item, no question that if something is heard a lot, that's going to raise our antenna more, right? We're going to be more interested because, wow, there's a whole bunch of people that are saying this, there must be something going on. And then you really do think, is this an issue that is a gap in the code? Is that why this is coming up? Or is it just not clear in the context? And you think that maybe this is something then that does require producing more guidance to show people that, yes, this is already in the code. And that's an important distinction for lots of obvious reasons. But I will say that just because something was mentioned once, that's, again, a lot of professional judgment comes in there, because there can be, and in fact, this certainly happened, we've seen this happen. There's people that are really well connected and are more removed from the minutia and are thinking of the bigger picture, and they come up with a comment and they tie certain connections together, particularly as these questions have arisen for them while they're trying to implement some technology or they're dealing with this. And so they've had active discussions, and a question has come up and it's been an unresolved question. Then it comes to us and it hasn't come from any other stakeholder. And our group says, wow, that's a really good question. You know, that's not something that has come up before. And it's something that we should take on board and really think about. So I don't know that it's not the number of times that impacts the priority, it's the quality of the statement and the rationale that the person has provided as to why this is an issue that's arising for them. But I think de facto, if something comes up a lot of times, it does get more attention, right? That's just human nature. But we think about every comment that has come in and whether or not that's something that, you know, is something that we really need to be spending a bunch of time on, or is this something that we just say, yeah, because there are many individual comments that came up that you say, yeah, okay, that's an interesting point, but it's background, or we don't see how that's really a factor, and so on. But professional judgment is what, is the only thing you can really rely on to sort through that. But yeah, it's a hairy problem.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
We're on an hour and a half, right?
Sorry? Yeah. We still have half an hour.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. We're good.
You can move to the next. I think that there are no other comments on this part of the presentation, so we can move to the next one on the juicy part.
Yeah, some of the juicy part. I keep doing that. I say it's somewhat the juicy part because it's a sampling of where we're at this point. It's not the whole story of where we're at. That comes in September, but this should give you a good idea. So I'm going to walk through a selection of the insights that we're considering, some of the characteristics, so that you have a better idea of what's going to be in front of you in September, or I guess in August, because you'll already have it by then. Okay.
Sorry, Brian. Brian, sorry for interrupting you. It was my mistake. We were scheduled to break at 10.
Oh, to break
not at 10:30. So, but of course, you will finish your presentation just to have the time in mind. Okay.
Well, now's a perfect stopping point.
And sorry to all of you for my mistake.
Now's a perfect stopping point if we want to break, because.
But after the break is no longer technology. It's another topic.
Oh, right.
So let's finish this topic before the break, okay?
Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, you're bang on point then. Okay. All right. So I will cruise through this this section. Okay. So just as with the themes, our insights or issues that are that we're seeing, we see some different characteristics between these, and I'll just sort of quickly classify them this way. Some of these are unique to the technology area, while others are being expressed to us in the context of discussions around technology, but often with the understanding that they go beyond just the technology perspective. Some of the items are entirely new, others are previously things that have been addressed or expressed by other stakeholders, but now in a different context or with some new connective tissue. And then finally, some of the items are focused on PAs directly, whereas other ones also relate to the broader ecosystem within organizational environments. And note that these aren't mutually exclusive characteristics, and we're not purposefully going to be labeling these, but they're just characteristics that we note, and just so you have a flavor of the things that we're seeing. Okay, in terms of a unique issue to technology, and Lori, this one gets to your point earlier around the use of data. We're considering a question regarding how the code applies to using client data to train AI models, which benefit from quality data sets, such as client data, so that they can learn effectively. So if a firm trains its system on actual client data, let's assume that there's client consent and the data is anonymized, that can of course help the firm improve its audit quality with an improved tool, which is obviously in the public interest, but arguably it's also in the firm's interest for competitive and economic reasons. And so the question arises as to whether the use of client data in this way would be seen as confidential information for the firm's advantage. The same question can obviously come up in a corporate perspective in a PAIB capacity. And I'll just note, Luigi, this is one of the points that came up from a single stakeholder, and yet it's an important point, right? And it's not something that other folks have said, and I think that's because other folks have not hit this as an issue head on, but this particular individual, this is something that was very notable to them. And we thought, you know what, that's a really good question. So that's again where some judgment comes in. Okay. For a contrasting example that applies not just to working with disruptive technologies, one that I also referenced during Jens's presentation is the notion of expectations for PAs around ethical leadership in situations that would be considered gray zones. From a tech perspective, this could include situations where a PA's firm or a company is developing or implementing technology in a fully legal manner, but perhaps because of aggressive timelines or lack of resources, they pay less attention to data security or bias or other risks of potential social harm than an independent person, an outsider, might consider appropriate. So still legal, but you know, they're kind of cutting corners a little bit and pushing the limits. And as I noted earlier, stakeholders are telling us that it's more important than ever for PAs, especially those who are in decision-making roles, to be at the table, to provide sound ethics guidance in those kinds of gray zone situations. This insight could also really relate to any area where there are complex circumstances, as are well described in the ED, and the resulting potential for significant unintended consequences. Remember that we aren't also the only professionals who assemble multidisciplinary teams. So for example, with tech implementations, sustainability decisions, interjurisdictional tax matters, and so on, when others who are responsible for selecting individuals to be on the team, stakeholders are looking to ensure that PAs are going to be at or near the top of the list to be included on those teams where it's not the PA putting the team together. There is a potential collaboration opportunity, or at least this content is going to be food for thought for our tax planning task force colleagues, as well as for sustainability probably. Okay, next one is an issue that we've heard recently that we hadn't heard earlier in the process. So this is something new, where there's a concern that when advanced technologies are being used or relied on, that PAs might not be sufficiently involved in the decision making, which aligns with what the TEG and other observers mentioned, and that there ends up being a bit of an outsourcing, so to speak, of the responsibility for oversight and appropriate due care related to the system or the tool. This kind of thing can happen when an external expert comes in, consults to a company developing or implementing a technology, or they provide advice on a tech-related issue. the PA might not retain responsibility for oversight and then might become overly deferential to reliance on the expert's judgment. Oftentimes, then this was the main issue that was raised, external consultants then end up leaving the organization, they stop the engagement, and then the company is again left on their own, which creates new risks around a lack of ability to monitor or the internal control capacity over what's happening. And stakeholders urge that PAs ensure that they try to stay informed in terms of the process, but also there's a thought about ensuring that those charged with governance are aware of the risks and the ethics concerns of technology that's being developed and implemented. And so there's a suggestion perhaps of communications of matters like the scope of the technology being used, the reliance, the explainability issues, the limitations in understanding the technology or areas of conflict of interest with respect to experts that are being relied on. So in another kind of component of ethical leadership, and again, we don't bear sole responsibility, of course, but that we do play an essential role in ensuring that ethics are being considered, and stakeholders know that we have the ear of those charged with governance. So we're thought to be in a good position to do that. And there aren't at this point specific provisions in the code around requiring or encouraging communications with those charged with governance really outside of the no-CLAR area. And so is that something that could be considered? And then on the flip side, a persistent issue that's been around for a long time is around the custody of client data, and not in the hosting sense. It's something that's becoming increasingly common in a wider range of contexts, has more and more focus of regulators and consumers. We heard that today again. Data is not typically recognized as an asset on the balance sheet, but there is consensus among stakeholders that data loss, misappropriation, and so on obviously have significant consequences. In the context of the code, section 350 talks about custody of client data, but data isn't contemplated in that section. As many of you will recall, we had that discussion at the board during the June meeting last year as part of the TTF's work, but that sort of the furthering of that discussion was deferred because additional research and information was requested on this concept of data as an asset. And so we've been continuing to gather thoughts in the area, of questioned numerous stakeholders very directly about their views on how it should be handled from an ethics perspective and in the context of a PA's role, again, in data governance, to get back also to Mark's point, with the hope that our ongoing work will then assist the board in going forward in that regard and making some decisions around what we do with it. Okay, last couple of examples that reflect on some comments that are PA-centric and other ones are broader PA-centric, ongoing concerns raised around pressures on PAs. That pressure is expressed in a bunch of different ways. It's again something that is persistent in that it's been raised for some time. It includes feeling pressure from information overload, a lack of time and other available resources, and then just more generally around the pace of change, whether it's technology, legal, regulatory, or what have you. In their role as leaders in many, and especially, we're thinking here, especially small and medium-sized organizations, PAs also face frequent pressures that they should find magic technologies to achieve performance targets through different tools like automating processes and implementing AI. Compounding this issue is the fact there's often time pressure that threatens their ability to effectively understand and assess whether the use of a particular technology is reasonable and appropriate. And in our discussions with stakeholders, these pressures sometimes are framed as PAs feeling intimidated, but not in the sense as is described in the code now. The intimidation can come from a sense of being just legitimately, and I can't imagine anyone in this room has not felt this, unless you have unlimited capacity, just legitimately overwhelmed by the technology, including for some folks, right, simply not possessing, and I'm not referring to this room, you just don't possess the capacity to understand the technology. And it's just simply a fact, right? I mean, there is a bell curve of people getting through systems and understanding things and having sufficient experience to work with items at a competent level. Not everyone gets there. Not all of us are going to become an astronaut because we're just never going to achieve that. Even if you wanted to do that, it's just not going to be possible. Also a lack of time, pace of change, and so on. But all of these pressures are linked because they're pressures other than exerted by another individual, but they're really just environmental pressures that come up within the professional environment or within oneself. You can put pressure on yourself as well, right? Okay, and then finally, just an example of an insight that considers the broader ecosystem. Stakeholders commented in a very similar manner, and this was interesting because it was not something that we went out and asked about, but there's been some broad discussion around the potential application of the code to non-PAs. So thinking about our code and from the PA's perspective, applying it to non-PAs that are especially on some of the multidisciplinary teams. There's a recognition that because decisions around how to develop and implement technologies depend on those multidiscipline teams, achieving decisions depends more than just on a PA's ethics at the table and the promotion of ethics, but an expressed belief that there's a shared responsibility. And so a question that comes up is, how do we encourage PAs to think about evaluating those that they deal with, and particularly when there's important ethical issues that are engaged, ensuring that those folks are conducting themselves at a minimum in the spirit of the fundamental principles. So proactively thinking about, what is this person's integrity? Are they really objective, and things along those lines? So and perhaps that's a guidance issue, but I mean, it does align obviously with the strategic issue that we're asking stakeholders about also. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up just with the what's next, which is just a timeline thing. As I said, we're meeting to finish our consideration of the different insights today and tomorrow. The outputs at the end of tomorrow will then flow into both our draft phase 2 report that'll be finalized throughout this month, as well as sending the TTF our additional relevant analysis components for that are relevant to their mandate for them to noodle over. Next, the draft report will be provided in full to the TEG for their comments and feedback, particularly to check that we got the technology aspects right and some of the connective tissue. And then from that point onward, we complete the final report to be presented to you at the September meeting for consideration prior to its anticipated publication in Q4. All right. As you'd expect, it's going to tie back. This is really mostly a placeholder slide. It's going to tie back to the TWG's mandate. We're going to hit on both of the issues there that were in front of us. So putting all the different themes in, the analysis, the rationale, the various background and context. So it's useful for a broad range of users, clearly for the board with respect to particularly code types of issues, but also other stakeholders to show this is the work that's been conducted and here's what our findings were. In addition, we'll include the various, links to the various thought leadership pieces, the articles, the new exploring the code components that are being produced and so on, and suggestions around non-authoritative materials that might still be developed. And lastly, though this is not explicitly in our mandate, it does seem reasonable that we should at least provide some thoughts on how the board might wish to continue monitoring technology innovations going forward. Some of our preliminary thoughts are just here on this slide. Ensuring that board members are up to speed on the emerging issues in the tech space on a regular basis. Also the connection with sustainability, because again, that seems to be a growing topic there. Also recognition that regular, though perhaps less frequent and intense, as has been happening in the past few years with the tech initiative, but that there still is a mechanism for ongoing appropriate environmental scanning. So these issues can come in front of the board. And then there can be an analysis of the issues that are identified so that we don't, as a board, fall behind as tech continues to progress. Sadly, it won't be as James would like. That tech is not going to stop, the innovations won't stop. And so we do want to see how some of these newer implementations really do play themselves out and what actual ethics issues arise from those in business and firm environments. All right, that is it. So
thank you very much, Brian. Of course, we are late, but of course, I will open the floor for any comments, considerations. Sorry? Yeah, I see. Robert. Please, Robert.
Thank you, Chair, and hello to everyone. I was just going to make a brief comment, Chair, just from a bit at the end of the item, but happy to make it now, and I will make it very truncated, just to thank the working group for the presentation and the great amount of engagement that's gone on, and the distilling into those 8 themes is obviously very helpful. It's looking responsive to the public interest, and I'm sure that that focus will continue as the working group continues the work towards the report in September, which we'll look forward to seeing. There were some comments, I think, by my colleague Begonia at the previous meeting about the technology, the TEG, and I noticed the question came up again this morning. So, and Brian, I'm not quite sure what further opportunities there are to consider expanded membership of that group, but that's something that is still on the POB's radar, just from a perspective of representativeness geographically and different stakeholder groups and the like, but also this forward focus that's come into the discussion today. So that's all, Chair, very positive, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. And the other, Brian, please.
I was just going to respond to Robert's point, which is a good one, and I know Junpei, I didn't directly address your comment on the same issue. It's something we did talk about at the last meeting, but I wanted to reiterate that for the TEG, part of the model is a sort of evergreening of that group as well. It's not meant to be a permanent group with fixed members for 5 years or something like that. We are looking at rotating, and our desire is, and one of the original intentions was, to ensure that we do rotate people onto and obviously off of that group. There is a limitation in terms of the number of people that we wanted to have on, so that we can have the appropriate level of depth and I guess really the involvement, the interaction with those individuals. And we think we have a very good group, but absolutely appreciate that it's not, well, it is a good idea to ensure that we continue to look at not only geographic diversity, but also the diversity from other backgrounds, right? And thinking about the mix of PAIB and maybe from different technology companies or things of that sort. So we do want to ensure that we have new folks that are brought to the table, but recognizing that if we add, you could have a group of 40 people and end up with another keg, but that becomes a huge administrative burden. And we're already very grateful to the IESBA for providing staff support and logistics around this. And so it could be considered pretty burdensome if we expand that too much, but definitely want to be responsive to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Ken, please.
Yeah, Brian, just a thought as the working group sort of almost turns into the home straight, and looks forward to finalizing the report and recommendations to the board for September. And as you think about the recommendations, there can potentially be a lot of them coming out of all the insights you've gathered, all the 425 items. They might or might not all end up in the final set of recommendations, but clearly you're going to distill them and synthesize, et cetera, et cetera. But as you think forward and just bear in mind that there is only so much that this board can do. I'm thinking about resource constraints and our capacity limitations and so forth. I think what would be useful really, and clearly the work of kind of completing the analysis still has to be done. But what would be useful would be if the working group were to identify which would be the best groups to take forward specific action items. And I'm thinking specifically in the context of non-authoritative material. There might be opportunities to address a number of themes or insights through the development of non-authoritative material, and not necessarily to reopen the code because the principles are already baked into the code and so forth. But if just to give you an example, for example, the area of competencies in education, there's quite a lot there, and if you were to identify specific questions or areas for further exploration through the avenue of non-authoritative material, maybe that could be a recommendation for the IPAE, or in fact more broadly. or even educational institutions or the broader academia as to what questions they might take forward. In other words, to provide input for them to think about and to invite a dialogue with the working group or with this board, for us to share our insights with them so that they can then take this forward. But there might be other areas clearly where it would be more appropriate for this board to come in and weigh in, especially if they are really close to the code and they're more of a technical nature. So I think really being a bit more specific as to who the main actors should be and what areas would be more appropriate, more suited for them to take forward, I think would be useful.
Thank you very much, Ken, for this pragmatic approach. This is indeed a matter of concern as we go forward. So I think that Ken's observations are very welcome. So any other comments, questions? If not, Brian, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation and for the impressive work done since last March and the impressive report and the identification of these insights and issues which are of utmost importance. Thank you very much. And the discussion around table shows the importance of us as a board of keeping on alert and monitoring the developments. As you say, it is not going to stop. So it's a standing issue. Thank you very much, and we will wait for the report in September. Thank you. So we will break now. I apologize again for my mistake. I was indeed mistaken about the timings, but we will reconvene at, if I may suggest, 10:45 at the latest. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I apologize too, but thanks for the fantastic feedback. It was constructive, helpful, and will help our processes progress.
So welcome back to the last part of our meeting. And I would like to start, even if we are a little bit late, but we have to go through the minutes of the last meeting. Thank you for those to those who have provided comments and suggestions to the draft minutes. A revised vision has been kindly distributed by Astu. You may have seen them, and it's now time to provide your last comments, last opportunity, and to approve the minutes. And so I would ask you if you still have any comments or contributions. Otherwise, thank you very much. And the minutes of the last meeting are approved. And moving now to the next topic in the agenda on the engagement team and group audit independence. We are going to have an update from the working group, from the task force, by Caroline. I don't see Caroline. Oh, she's there. Caroline, an update of the work of the group, the recent activities, and some comments and questions that were raised during some recent outreach activities, as well as the proposed project timeline until the schedule approval of the final pronouncements. I will only recall that there was an exposure draft out for comments until the end of May, and that Caroline and the task force can maybe provide us with the early, some early comments or information about the responses received. Caroline, without losing more time, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to start by introducing the other members of the Engagement Team Group Audit Independence Task Force. So you've got Sadia, who's in the room with you. We also have on video Denise Canavan, a former IESBA technical advisor, and Andrew Pigney, the IESBA technical advisor to Laurie. We're well supported by Sylvia and Ken. So Sylvia, if we can go on to the next slide. So as Gabriella mentioned, this presentation is to brief the board about the task force activities since December 2021, to highlight certain conceptual comments that we received through outreach activities and comment letters received before 30th of May in response to our exposure draft, and to set out the proposed project timeline until the scheduled approval of the final pronouncement. So going on to the next slide, the activities since December 2021. At this point, I'd like to actually express my thanks to Sylvie Solier and Jens Pohl. They were the former chair and member of the task force respectively, as well as Kala Vijayan, who supported the task force in our work. I would also like to express my thanks to the IESBA members and staff who coordinated with us on this project. This group of people supported us through the publication of the exposure draft in February, and the ISA 600 revised task force members, as well as IESBA staff, joined us on the 2 global webinars that we held in April. We also conducted outreach activities with different stakeholders since our meeting in December. So in March, we presented a broad outline of the exposure draft to the IFIA Standards Coordination Working Group. And I'm pleased to say that we do have a comment letter from IFIA that we received today. In May, we participated in a call with Accountancy Europe to get their views on the exposure draft, and Accountancy Europe has also submitted their comment letters in writing. We were invited to participate in a roundtable organized by APS be in Australia, and that gave us an opportunity to present the exposure draft to the group and also receive their first impressions and comments. And IESBA has also submitted their written comments. The task force met on 31st of May to review observations from these outreach activities, as well as early comment letters that we received before 30th May, some of which we will share with the board today. So on the next slide, just a recap. The objective of this project are twofold. First is to align the definition of the term engagement team in the code with the revised definition of the same term in ISA 220 revised, while ensuring that the independence requirements in the International Independence Standards are clear and appropriate and apply only to those individuals within the scope of the revised definition who must be independent in the context of a particular audit engagement. The second objective is to revise the International Independence Standards so that they are robust, comprehensive, and clear when applied in a group audit context, including with respect to independence for non-network component auditor firms. And so in December of last year, we approved, the board approved for exposure, an exposure draft that proposes revisions to the definition of engagement team and the related terms audit team, assurance team, and review team as a result of changes to the definition of engagement team in IESBA's quality management standards, which includes ISA 220. We also propose revisions to the International Independence Standards to address considerations in a group audit for individuals and firms to address a breach of an independence provision at the component auditor firm level. We also propose conforming amendments to the code arising from the IESBA's recently finalized ISA 600 revised and quality management standards. So these proposals were developed in close coordination with the IESBA within the established coordination framework of the two boards that Sadia had spoken about in yesterday's meeting. On the next slide, just to give you some information about the two global webinars, we delivered the same content, and these webinars were delivered by Denise, Andrew, and myself. Apart from presenting the exposure draft provisions, we also responded to questions to clarify the understanding of participants and to capture points for the task force consideration as we continue our work. There were 270 participants from over 50 jurisdictions who joined the webinar. The majority of the participants came from Europe and North America. And whilst the majority of the participants were practitioners, including SMPs, we also had participation from IFAC member bodies, national standard setters, regulators and other oversight authorities, preparers and other PAIBs, investor reps, those charged with governance, academics, educators, and participants from the public sector organization. Going on then to an overview of the early comments that we received. So we received 15 early comment letters before 30th May, which was when the task force met and considered or reviewed these comment letters. And those 15 early comment letters included 3 from regulators and oversight bodies. These early comments are generally supportive of the proposals in the exposure draft and have raised some issues for the task force to work through. So on slide 7, the respondents were generally supportive of the efforts to align and achieve consistency with the definition in IESB's standards. And these include respondents such as IOSCO and CEAOB, as well as IFIA, who submitted their letter to us today. The proposal that the engagement quality reviewer may be sourced from outside the group auditor firm and its network was also supported. The application material on non-assurance services and changes in component auditor firm were, there was general support for this, but there were comments for the task force and the board's consideration. And I'll go into some of these details later on. There was also general support for provisions to address a breach of independence by component auditor firms. But there were questions about the difference between dealing with breach of independence by a component auditor firm within the group auditor firm's network and one who is outside of the group auditor firm's network. And lastly, there was general support for alignment of the effective date of the final pronouncement on engagement team group audit with that of ISO 600 revised. And then now going into some of the concerns or areas that the task force would look into. So on the next slide. Thanks, Sylvia. Some respondents reiterated comments that they had provided to the IEESB when the IEESB issued the ISO 600 revised exposure draft, and they expressed concerns with the focus on group audits. The concern was that this focus might change perception and might lead to a diminished value of local statutory financial statement audits. And a consequence of that would be that, or could be that it might cause the SMPs to be forced out of the component auditor market, thereby exacerbating market concentration. And this comment came from the IFAC SMP advisory group, as well as certain PAOs. There was also concern about the adverse impact on choice of component auditor firms and how that might impact the use of smaller non-network component auditor firms in particular. So for example, components may be scoped in or on an unpredictable basis and may vary from year to year, creating challenges for component auditor firms, given that they would need to be independent. And this might disrupt the group audit process and might therefore impact the group auditor firm's willingness to use a non-network component auditor firm. This issue of choice is of particular concern in certain jurisdictions where there are few auditors with the needed competencies to audit specific sectors, or who might need certain specific skills in order to carry out a quality audit. On the next slide, there were also concerns raised around definitions, the definitions. So notwithstanding that there was support for alignment, there were concerns that some of the definitions were complex. So for example, the complexity of the engagement team and audit team definitions. And the suggestion was that there's a need for clarity as we apply the ISO 600 definitions in our code. So there's a request for more guidance on subparagraph D of the audit team definition on individuals who can influence the outcome of the audit engagement. There were also questions about how other experts fit into the definition. For example, in the case of ESG assurance services, tax experts, and consultations with public accountancy organizations on professional and technical issues. With respect to the definition of group audit client, this includes components that are not related entities as defined in the code. So there were concerns that this will extend the independence to entities that are outside the related entities definition. There were also concerns that that firms would encounter practical difficulties in monitoring all components. Some respondents also wondered whether all members of the audit team for a group audit should be subject to the same independence provisions, and wanted or suggested that there should be some differentiation. On the next slide, on the other hand, we had a regulator who commented that component auditor firms should be subject to the same independence requirements, whether they are part of the group auditor firm's network or not. And other respondents that requested the board consider whether all non-network component auditor firms performing audit procedures on a component audit client that is not a PIE should be subject to PIE independence requirements just because the group audit client is a PIE. So the view expressed was that it might be appropriate if the component auditor firm performed significant audit procedures and can directly influence the outcome of the group audit, but not across the board. Some respondents recognize the proportionate approach for independence of component auditor firms, but suggested that the board develops a more scalable approach. On the next slide, there were several comments on whether the component auditor firm should apply the PIE or non-PIE independence requirements based on whether the group audit client is a PIE or non-PIE. And so some respondents wondered whether there's value in providing what they considered or termed a concession to apply non-PIE independence requirements if the non-network component auditor firm is required to apply more stringent PIE requirements for purposes of the statutory audit of the PIE component audit client. Where the group audit client is a non-PIE, adherence to non-PIE independence requirements might be required, but this should not preclude the adoption of more stringent PIE independence requirements where the component audit client is a PIE. And this is in the area of long association as well as fees. Thirdly, we then had a regulator comment that the component auditor firm should adopt the most stringent independence requirements for both the statutory audit and the group audit to prevent complexity. We also had another respondent wonder which PIE definition to apply when the component audit client exists in a different jurisdiction from the group audit client, and the jurisdictional definitions of PI differs as a result of the recently finalized PI pronouncements. So as a result, the task force would have its work cut out in looking at how we can clarify the definitions and the application of the independence requirements. On the next slide, there were also other issues that were raised. And one issue is in relation to the process for addressing breaches of component auditors. And so some respondents questioned why the process for network and non-network component auditor firms are different when it comes to a breach of independence. And so this is because in the extant code, there's already existing provisions in relation to breach of independence by the firm and its network firm. So if you have a component auditor firm who's in the same network as the group auditor firm, there's already an existing provision in the extant code to deal with that situation. And the task force essentially looked at those provisions and took those provisions and built the provisions in section 405 in relation to breach of independence by a component auditor firm that's not within the group auditor firm's network, so as to have a complete capture of all breaches of independence by all component auditor firms. But there is suggestion that the treatment is different, whether it is a component auditor firm in the group auditor firm's network or outside. So there were also other suggestions that there should be further guidance regarding the process for component auditor firms in the group auditor firm's network. So the task force will review how best to set up consistent breach provisions for all component auditor firms, whether in or outside the group auditor firm's network, and provide guidance in this area. So we received comments from IESBA, CAOB, IFIA, UKFRC, various regulators and oversight bodies on this. There were also a number of practical matters raised, for example, on the timing of determination of components and changes in components when the group audit is in progress or from year to year. And this would trigger the determination of component auditor firms late in the process. And as a result, these component auditor firms might have issues that impinge on auditor independence straight off the bat. So these practical matters would also be something that the task force would be looking into. So those were just a high-level overview of some of the conceptual comments that the task force identified from the early comment letters. On the next slide, it shows you the breakdown of comment letters that we have received as of yesterday. Okay, yesterday my time. Okay, yeah, so it's early morning there. Correct, as of 7th of June. And we had received a total of 41 comment letters. So as at 30th of May, we had 15 letters. And since then, we have received 41. As of 30th of May, the comment letters that we received, none of the comment letters came from the GPPC firms, but as of 7th June, we have received their letters. So there's 9 firms that have provided their comments. In terms of the regulators and oversight bodies, as of 30th May, we had 3, and we have 6 as of 7th of June, and including IFIA's letter, we now have 7. We do expect to receive a few more letters. So some respondents have indicated that they're not able to submit in time, but that they do intend to provide their written comments. If you look at the geographical spread of respondents, we do have quite a good geographical spread. And it is understandable that when you look at the stakeholder group, that the majority, 23 PAOs, 9 firms, the majority come from practitioners and professional accountancy organizations. But we welcome responses received from all stakeholders, and we thank them all for their efforts. The task force will be reviewing these in detail when we meet in July. And then just going on to the final slide, the next step in the project timeline is that we hope to bring back to the board a full review of key comments on the exposure draft and the first read of our proposed revision. We'll also present that at the September CAC meeting. Between our September and December board meeting, we hope to circulate a set of updated texts via email, and we will also conduct outreach activities to key stakeholders. The aim is to have a second read of the proposed revisions in our December meeting and approve the final text at that meeting. The effective date proposed is for audits of financial statements for periods beginning on or after 15 December 2023, in line with ISA 600 revised. So with that, I would like to open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And the floor is open. Chana, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Caroline, for the presentation, and also thank you for coming and presenting at the APSB roundtable as well. I think, yes, a lot of it is conforming amendments, and ISA 600 seems to have changed the concept from material components to any component that you have touched or done some audit work on, and it has created some concerns. From a principle space, we can't sort of question the key things that have been included in the exposure draft, but there's some concerns from the practitioners on how to operationalize it, as well as the impact it has on the SMP. So I encourage the task force to take it into consideration and think about a proportionate approach. Unfortunately, we couldn't think of a solution, Caroline. So, but I think it's worthy of taking some of those comments and thinking of a proportionate approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Chana. Caroline, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Caroline. I find this one of the areas where it's conceptually it's difficult, And it has been difficult, and it's because of the subject matter, not because of any deficiencies in the working group or task force. I wonder, because of that, what thought has been given into the development of some sort of decision trees? Because I get a lot of questions on this. And I think if it were possible, to what extent the task force has discussed that, would a decision tree approach be helpful, do you think?
Thank you, Galen. Yao Shu, please.
Thank Chair, thank Caroline. And I think these concerns are very practical, and I'm looking forward to the discussion of the concerns in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Yao Shu. Mark, please.
Thank you, and really good to hear where the group has got to. It's no secret, because we've already put a comment letter in where sort of my views are. I think one of the things that I'd sort of add to what Galen said is that there is, to me at least, there is an attractiveness in making the arrangements as simple as possible, i.e. consistent, because otherwise you run the risk of needing a series of almost like transitional measures to recognize that if you have different requirements to different tiers and components are moving between those tiers, it becomes very complicated indeed. And I don't have an answer to it, Caroline, but I'll be really interested to see where the working group goes, where the task force goes, because I think that simplicity is quite an important point to try and adhere to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Brian, please.
Thanks. I just want to also reiterate the same comments. The idea of having some sort of visual aids within the guidance is something that would be really useful. And just thinking about paragraph 50 of the explanatory memorandum, that's really useful, and that might be something that the task force could consider including directly in this section, or as part of some kind of follow-on non-authoritative material, and some sort of diagram as well, distinguishing between an engagement team, audit team, review team, assurance team, and so on, just again to provide some more clarity around those factors. I think would be helpful for users, again, especially for folks who don't access the code as frequently as many of us are forced to or love to.
Thank you, Brian. Mark, do you want to? Okay. So Caroline, do you want to provide any reaction to these questions and comments, please?
Yes, thanks, Gabriella. Thanks everyone for your comments. China, the task force does recognize the concerns with how to operationalize the provisions and the impact on the SMPs. So we have, in coming up with the first round exposure draft, we have taken an approach that we should be proportionate in the provisions, and given that the definition of component auditor firm is actually quite wide, and the task force will definitely continue to look at how we can address this and make it easier for practitioners. Thank you. Galen and Brian, in terms of visual aids and decision tree, definitely we will look at that. So for example, in the exposure draft where we had the appendix 2, where we had the decision tree on breaches, some of the early comment letters, the respondents actually gave us feedback that was useful. In terms of the the diagram in paragraph 50 of the EM, that actually led to quite a bit of confusion in the understanding of the definition. But we definitely do agree that making it easy to understand and pictorially easy, either by graphic or a decision tree, would be helpful, and we'll certainly look at that. Yao Shu, your comments about the practical concerns that have been raised, and the task force will come back and report back on how we've addressed that in our September meeting. And Mark, your comments about making the arrangements as simple as possible. As much as we would like to do that, to make it simple, because we have heard feedback from various comment letters about the complexity. There's also on the other hand, the request for proportionality or a proportionate approach. So it's really trying to find the right balance in the public interest. Chair, I think I've addressed all comments. Denise or Andrew or Sadia, would any of you like to add any comments?
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Caroline. I don't see anyone wanting to provide more comments. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's important for us to have this update on where the project is and these initial reactions from our stakeholders. I'd like to highlight a number of responses which I don't have the history of these consultations, of these exposure drafts, but I think that it's an impressive number, considering that we are in a period where other exposure drafts are out for consultation, and that we have been asked to be careful about that. So I think it's a considerable number of responses, which shows the importance of the issue, despite its complexity and conceptual difficulty, and technicality, which I would say would not make expectable such a number of responses. Anyway, still on the process. You said it, and we know that there are some stakeholders who said that they were struggling with the deadline for responses, and of course, exceptionally some responses that may still come would be important. But also, I thank you, Caroline, and the task force for the outreach activities that you have been undertaking, because the comments and the inputs received in those occasions are also important, even coming from those who did not respond formally to the exposure draft. So thank you very much for that additional effort in this period. And yes, this is a conceptually complex issue, very technical as well, but that, as we can see, poses some concerns, and this need to adapt, to possibly adjust. Also regarding the developments at the IESBA or the ISA side, it's important. So thank you for the work done. We will be very much expecting the follow-up of this in September and see where we are with a view to completing the work by December, as you are suggesting. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much to the task force. Well. So if there's anything else on the technical or on the projects and the agenda at this point, we would now close the session. Ken, do you have anything before some closing remarks? So if not, we are a little bit late, but before, sorry. Oh, sorry, Robert, I was not seeing you. Robert, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to just make some closing remarks, if I could. Is now the right time to do that?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Please.
Yeah, thank you. So from the PIOB, thank you very much for the opportunity to observe the meeting. And I'm sorry again that I haven't been able to be in New York, but it's the technology has worked really well. And I think we've learned so much from the technology over the past couple of years. Although I would say that it's no substitute for being face-to-face. And we're actually looking forward to having our first face-to-face PIOB meeting in Madrid next month, and Gabriella, I understand you'll be attending that, as will Tom, and so there will be an opportunity there for us to have a good discussion about the forward planning of both boards, the working together, and the public interest. And I think that'll be very timely given the strategy survey, which is currently out from this board for comment as well. And I guess it's been a very forward-looking agenda, and there's been a bit of a theme that's emerged today, hasn't there, about being forward-looking in the technology area, but the sustainability topic clearly is that, and was very encouraging to both hear the presentation on the first day and to see the depth of the work which the working group is getting into under Mark's leadership, but also then the responsiveness on reflection yesterday with the realisation that that this issue is moving so quickly, and everyone's moving very quickly on it, and it is disruptive, and it's important to be responsive. So I thought that was a very strong aspect of the discussion as well. And the EIOC discussion also yesterday I thought was very powerful, and really encouraged the board to continue with that work. And of course that will also feed into the responses to the strategy survey. And can I just make a response in relation to the technology discussion? Ken, you made a point at the end, which I think was a very powerful point. With these cross-cutting issues, it's very important for the standard setting boards to be across these issues and to be thinking about how they can inform other areas of work. I mean, it's a self-evident point, but I thought your point, Ken, about just urging the working group to tailor its recommendations and to think about how they can both be manageable, but also can inform the other areas of work, I think is a really important thing, Chair, and well worth thinking about. So I think it's been a very good meeting. I've enjoyed listening to it and observing, and clearly next time you'll have tax, you'll have two technology topics. The topic we've just discussed, and thank you, Caroline, for the update on that. And so it's going to be a very busy agenda. The observer at the next meeting will be a new PIOB colleague, Shiko Morise, who is intending to be in New York with you for that meeting. And I'm sure you'll look forward to welcoming her there. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much, Robert, for joining us for this over these 3 days, and for your very insightful and attentive comments, which will, of course, be taken on board and considered. Thank you very much for being with us and for making your time. Well, on my side, very briefly before we close the public session of the board, first things first, thank everybody around the table, the board members, the brave staff that made this meeting not only possible but also seamless in terms of organization, impeccable preparation of the documents, of the agenda, of everything. I'd like to thank also the TAs, Galen and the consultative working group for everything that you have been providing us with, and all those who in a way or another contributed to make this meeting possible and fruitful. I must say that from my perspective, at least, this was a very productive meeting. We advanced in some subjects in a way that it was, I would say, not even expectable. available. It shows the commitment of the board members and of the staff of doing work. I reiterate what I already said yesterday, talking about the specific project, but I think that it applies to all the projects and to all the mindset, the role and mindset of this board, which is being able to think about things in a different way, to really embrace change also in a perspective, in our perspectives, in the way we address and approach the issues, and this is important. I'd also use again a word that I think illustrates, describes what these meetings have been about, which is being constructive. What I see around the table, without exceptions, is that all of the board members are contributing and trying to make the best for us as a board to come up with a meaningful outputs, with meaningful and impactful contributions, and this is something that leaves me very very confident for the future of the board. Looking forward to September, into September and December, I think that we will have a little bit, we will be busy for sure, and that those meetings will be very critical because a lot of decisions will have to be made. Some projects will hopefully reach the end or reach a critical phase of the project. So we will be called to make decisions. I think that this meeting was mostly about preparing ourselves and preparing the grounds for the not always the easy decisions that we will have to take and to make until the end of the year. So I think that we should be prepared for Nashville, and again, maybe the music will help, and I hope so, because we will have a very busy time, and same thing in December. Hoping that all of those who are observing us and will not join us in the executive session have a good summer break and be ready to join us again in September. Of course, in the meantime, providing us with all the insights and contributions that you may have, but being ready for September and for new meetings. Thank you very much to all of you, and I'm very grateful for the support of you all, also to me, and to making my life very easy. Thank you very much. And we can close now the public session.
Let's take a 5-minute break to allow us to recalibrate our session to the executive and basically bid farewell.